unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Missing in Action, Why You Should Care About Public Policy is the title of a new book by my guest on the show this week, Pranay Kotasthane, and his co-author, Raghu Jaitley. What is the Indian state? How does it work? How does it fail? And how can it evolve? These are just some of the questions that this important new book tries to tackle. Unlike most books in this genre, it's written for the proverbial man or woman on the street, refraining from jargon and acronyms to educate and possibly even to entertain readers interested in how policy is made. To talk more about the book and the lessons it holds, I'm pleased to welcome Pranay to the podcast for the very first time. Pranay, congrats on the book.
Thanks, Milan, and glad to be on Grand Tamasha. I have been an active listener of the show, so glad to be here talking about on the show as well. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate that very much, and it's so good to have you. I want to start, Pranay, by asking you a little bit about the overall kind of aim of the book, right? The very first chapter in the book is called Making Public Policy Interesting. But you know better than I that, in any given year, there are no shortage of books published on Indian politics, on policy, on the economy. Obviously, you and your co-author, Raghu Jaitley, felt something was missing from this discourse. Tell us a little bit about the sort of niche that you were hoping to fill with this book.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I think the number of books written on Indian public policy are quite few. And especially the ones which try to reach out to a broader audience is even lower. So, as you rightly said, the aim that we wanted to accomplish was to address the other side of the policy pipeline. That is, the people, the citizens, or anyone who's interested in knowing more about India and the Indian state. Why does it work the way it does? Why does it fail? Why does it sometimes succeed? Why does it sometimes fail? Just like India, the Indian state is so complicated. So the idea was, can we explain that better? And that was the reason why we started this.
So, Pranay, one of the things that I want to ask you about right up front is this really important conceptual issue that leads to a lot of confusion in our daily discourse. And you talk about the difference between a democracy and a republic, right? Now, if you and I were to open up Twitter right now or look at the op-ed pages, you'll see any number of people arguing that, look, in a democracy, majority rules. And whatever the majority party in India decides to do, by definition, is legitimate. How would you respond to this way of thinking? How do we think about the difference between these two things?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the curious thing, Milan, is that even sometimes when we celebrate our Republic Day, it is pretty similar to how we celebrate our Independence Day, so there is no distinction. So one area that we've been interested in is always trying to talk about the importance of the Republic. There's so much discussion on whether India has too less democracy or too much democracy, but people hardly discuss about the other part, which is the republic, and that's what our aim has been. So that the basic distinction according to us is this, that first of all, there's no sort of universal definition of democracy, but it literally means the rule of the people as against the rule by a monarch, right? So in reality, it can be defined as a rule by a majority. Now, what constitutes a majority can vary, but at the bare minimum, democracy means that whatever the majority of the populace agrees to will be carried out by the state. So that is broadly what democracy means. So now if you take it to its ideal type or the extreme scenario, then in a pure democracy, therefore, the majority rules in all cases, like you said, and that's why the confusion arises from this. So regardless of the consequences for the individuals, for those who are not in the majority, right? So, for example, the city-states in ancient Greece were democratic, right? And so it was within the laws of the state for Socrates to be killed through a majority sanction. It was a democratic decision in that sense, right? And this is what happens in our usual debates as well now, that people can say, things can be done just because 99% agreed to do that. But that's the critical distinction. India is not just a democracy. India is a democratic republic. It's the republic which says that it prevents the majority from using its coercive power against individuals or groups with lesser power. And this, might come as a surprise to many people. And our civics education, for example, teaches us that a republic is merely a state where the leader of the government is not in a hereditary position, right? But that's not the most critical idea behind a republic. In fact, conceptually, a republic is governed by a rule of law and not by a rule of men or women, and this means that the supreme power in any republic is the law and not a monarch. And that rule of law means that law also applies to every citizen in the state, including the PM, the president, etc., right? So it does not mean that the PM has the same power as I do, but it does mean that the PM is bound by a rule of law which is written in a document, often in the form of a constitution or a set of laws, etc. So that's what the republic is. And a corollary of this is that a republic recognizes certain inalienable and individual rights of citizens, right? So it says that no matter what, even if 99.99% agree that, wearing a blue t-shirt is evil and that should be punished, yet you cannot do that unless it is prescribed in the law, and that's the critical difference. And that's how the Indian Republic prevents the majority from running roughshod over a minority, even if that minority is a single person.
And there's one axis of conflict which is between this vision, right, of democracy versus republic. There's another axis of conflict which you talk about early on in the book, which is over ideology. And, you point out quite rightly that in India, there's no easy to discern kind of left-right ideological spectrum like there might be, say, in the United States, right, or the United Kingdom. And you say that one reason for this is because the country's core beliefs are to be statist, are to be socialist, and are to be conservative. But of course, there is ideological conflict on identity grounds, which you acknowledge, right? And various people have tried to map this out. Rahul Verma and Pradeep Chibber have a book where they talk about the status of the politics of recognition and the politics of statism, and you can plot political parties and political leaders according to these two axes. But of course, religion is the main ideological or identity cleavage, I should say, that seems to be salient today. Where is this conflict, right? Because at one point in time, you could say there is a conflict going on between this kind of Nehruvian, syncretic, liberal, secular vision and the kind of Savarkar vision of kind of Hindu nationalism. But it seems like this debate has moved into a direction which is more of the type of, well, what kind of Hindu vision we're going to end up with. Do you agree with that?
Actually, not quite. I still believe there is that conflict between the secular vision, and yes, there are varieties of different kinds of majoritarian ideas, but the idea of the secular republic still holds. And one way to recognize whether it is the grounds for conflict is to just see the daily debates, right? So the daily debates are still about this fundamental idea, right? If there were no politics over it, then we could have made the assumption that actually finally the contestation is just behind different types of Hindutva visions, but that's not clearly the case, right? So even the current debates are often about this fundamental idea that what should India be, right? And that just tells me that still there are debates across the board on this issue. Now, like you rightly said, yeah, left versus right doesn't make sense so much in India, and like Rahul's book does, in our imagination also, in fact, there are two axes along which, if we were to draw an Indian political compass, which Nitin at Takshashila has done this, and so there are two sort of axes which he puts. One is on the identity axis. So this identity can be not just religion, it can also be about linguistic identity or other identities, and the other axis would be liberty. So now if you look at these two axes, there are people you can place and you can make boxes, and there are different kinds of groups you can identify, right? For example, someone might be a nativist on the identity scale, but might also have very high liberty or ideas of freedom, whether it is economic, political, or social, right? So there can be various groups which might emerge on this. So left and right doesn't make sense, but yes, identity is a very important parameter, along with how much liberty people think others should have.
I want to ask you, Pranay, about the Indian state, because that's really what the core of the book is about. And, one of the examples that you use to discuss your views on the state is the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I just want to quote something that you've written with your co-author, where you say, while the first COVID-19 wave in April of 2020 gave a good glimpse into the nature of the Indian state, the second wave, a year later in the spring of 2021, told us a lot about the size of the Indian state. And I find this an interesting and a bit of a thought-provoking passage. Tell us a little bit, if you could, what you mean by these two responses, right? What did you see? What did you learn about the Indian state in wave one versus wave two?
Sure, yeah. So just to give a background, in the first wave, when there were around 500 cases, India, the Prime Minister came on the television at 8 p.m. on national television and said, from midnight, there will be a lockdown for over 2 weeks, and then that lockdown kept continuing, so citizens just got a total of grand total of 4 hours to comply with a lockdown which was national and so wide in scope, so that was the first wave. What we thought was it gives a glimpse into the nature of the Indian state, because there were a few things which happened. So for example, we saw that this Indian state can be called as the Republic of No, in the sense that the state is best when it has to stop something, and people gladly accepted it. There was a lockdown, there were no protests. In fact, even the migrants who were the most adversely affected, there were no protests. They accepted their sad fate and walked away, right? So the state had an immense power, that we realized, and when the state says something, people just complied. So that was one thing. The other thing we learned from this was that the state is also instinctive. So in the sense, the consequences of the lockdown weren't fully thought through. So for example, what would happen to the migrants? The people made thousands of kilometers of they had to walk to their places. So those things weren't fully thought through. Whereas in even the neighboring countries like Bangladesh, the lockdowns were planned in a more sequential manner, so that was the instinctive idea. The third one was, of course, it was also sometimes the state came across as reflexively socialist, so for example, the government just declared that private businesses had to absorb the pain. They couldn't fire people. They urged all establishments not to reduce salaries, etc. So this was just like the state saying that by diktat you have to follow some things, even though it is the state which gave 4 hours for people to go back home, right? So anyway, so state is our troubleshooter, and whatever state does is right, so that was one predominant thing that came out from the first wave response of the Indian state. Now, coming to the second wave, and second wave actually was much more severe, and as you know, lots of people died, and the reason was that we didn't have oxygen cylinders. We didn't have people being able to reach hospitals. There weren't enough hospital beds, etc. Right? So what we came to know in the second wave was just how small the Indian state is. Now, this is also quite counterintuitive for a lot of people, because the Indian state, the mental image that we have of it is, lots of files and people just whiling their time away behind these files, right? But the idea is that the Indian state is actually small on all important parameters that are really something that the state should be doing. So whether it is size by expenditure, size by employment, size by capability, we are small on all these parameters. But yes, what the state is big in is in ambition. So the state has this very vast ambition with very meager resources, and that often leads to us expecting the state to do great things. So there's a paradox between ambition and competence, and there's a vast gap between it, and that was exposed in the second wave when tragedy struck.
I want to sort of bring the earlier democracy conversation together with this conversation about the state. In chapter 5 of the book, you talk about this argument that you often hear in India, but also outside of India, that, India's problem is that it has too much democracy. And your response to this in the book is to say, look, India's real problem is not too much democracy. It's really an overextended state that's weak, right? And as you said just now, it's high ambition, minimal capacity. Now, at one point you say, look, hopefully, perhaps the COVID-19 pandemic, that kind of external shock could be the sort of shock that's needed to really get people's minds around this idea that you really need to invest in the building of a strong state, right? This particular government has often talked, at least in its rhetoric, about the need to refocus the state on a more streamlined set of core objectives. So as you sit here today, at the start of 2023, how do you assess the progress they've made toward this end? Do you think COVID-19 is going to be the shock that will actually right the ship?
I really want to say yes, but I would say not so much, because every policy domain is different. So when you talk about COVID-19, and we all know that public health is one area where the any state has a really, really important role. But in order for public health to become a priority, a lot of things should have happened in the policy pipeline before that, right? So we should have had vigorous debates about what kind of health policy India needs. We should have had a policy community built around it, which has debated this for years, committees formed which have proposed things, and hence when the crisis hits, you already have a set of solutions which have been debated, discarded, and some things bubble up to the top based on this intense discussions.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. One of the most enjoyable chapters in the book, at least from my perspective, was the chapter on the tyranny of fixing prices, right? Which is just sort of chock full of these amazing, slightly depressing examples about how the state has, repeatedly fixed prices and repeatedly gotten India into trouble. One of the most telling examples you narrate is that of the Delhi smog. And I wonder, just for the benefit of our listeners, if you could help us understand what price fixing has to do with the toxic Delhi air, because I'm not sure a lot of people would make the linkage between the two.
everyone thinks that some price is right, just like the salt in your biryani, prices should neither be too high or too low, they should just be perfect. And that's a widely shared belief from the citizen side, and that leads to citizen demand. So the idea that prices are in fact a signal which align the uncoordinated actions of so many thousands and millions of people is not so well understood. And if you have price fixing or price supports of various kinds, things can lead to adverse consequences is not something that is sort of broadly appreciated. So one example that we in fact found was from Ashok Gulati, who's a very well-known agriculture economist. So he talks about this example, and we've tried to put that in our own words. So now we know about Delhi smog, right? And in fact, it was going on until a month ago, and people now know that at least a part of it is caused by the crop residue which is burnt in Punjab, right? So now the question is, if I am to pose this question, if that's the reason, you just have to sequence the burning of those crops residue in a way such that you don't end up doing all this at one point of time, and you can just remove the Delhi smog, right? But that doesn't happen. Why is that so? Because it's not possible, because there is a very short time during which the people have to actually get rid of all their crop residue. Now you would ask, why is that the case? That's because the kharif crop, that is paddy, it can only be sown after June 15th. And what that means is there's a delayed output which leaves farmer with very little time to clear the field before the winter crops can be sown, right? So hence they have very little period, and the only way to get rid of the crop residue is just burn the residue as soon as possible. Now the question you should ask is, why is this arbitrary deadline of June 15th? Why can't people just keep the paddy, sow the paddy crop earlier? Now that's where again the government action comes in. So government of Punjab actually passed a Punjab Preservation of Subsoil Water Act in 2009, which actually prohibits paddy transplantation before June 15th. And if the rule is violated, paddy nurseries can be destroyed. The electricity supply can be disconnected. There can be no electricity for tube wells. So there are severe consequences, and generally people are complying to this. Now that should spark against another question, right? What explains these rules prohibiting paddy cultivation before June 15th? Now again, the reason is that ban is intended to save water during the peak summer season. So basically paddy farms need more water during summer times due to evaporation, and hence they said that you can't do this in the peak time of May, when summer is really peaking, right? So now that in turn should make us ask that why are farmers actually growing rice in this area where there is such a severe shortage of water? And to which the answer is a price signal called as the minimum support price, or MSP. Now, MSP is a government assured minimum price guarantee on the sale of particular crops, and it is an assurement. It is the assured procurement of rice by government, which incentivizes the overproduction of rice even in areas which are not well suited to the crop. So that is what happened, and one can argue that at one point of time MSP did make sense, because it started at a time when people like Paul Ehrlich had written books like Population Bomb, that India and Indians will die of hunger, etc. And the government said, the one way we will not do this is to incentivize growing of basic grains. But what we didn't realize is that action, which didn't have any sunset clause, which started this idea that there will be price support, had long-term economic and ecological consequences. And now we are seeing the result of that because of that MSP, the MSP has kept growing up, increasing, and now it's no longer minimum support price. Sometimes it is maximum support price. And what has happened because of that is this entire chain of events, which in fact leads to exacerbation of the Delhi smog crisis.
I mean, it's a fascinating interconnections, right, of issues in the story about unintended consequences, time and time again. I want to sort of maybe keep in this general domain of economics by asking you about another distinction you make in the book, which is between pro-market and pro-business policies, right? And the way you sort of lay it out and the way I've always understood it is that, look, pro-market policies help to create a level playing field for all firms. Pro-business policies are typically those that help establish powerful incumbents, and they become more powerful, right? One of the big policy initiatives of recent years that is worth mentioning is the PLI scheme, or the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, and the idea behind it, is fairly simple. The government is going to reward companies for additional sales of manufactured goods with a cash back. And if you sell more in a particular sector, you get more cash back. And this is a pretty clear example of a pro-business policy, right? Where you're essentially going to subsidize particular, champions. Now, the government would probably admit that, look, yeah, this is a pro-business policy, but it's the first step. It's the first step towards creating a new market, right? Once we seed these initial companies, seed these initial investments, 1,000 flowers will bloom. So it's really just a matter of sequencing. How do you see it? Is it possible that this pro-business outcome could lead to a pro-market one, or are there dangers in thinking of it as a sequence thing?
That is one big danger of any of these pro-business policies, right? So one thing is that there will be a false sense of achievement. The way we see it is that these are like band-aids over bullet wounds. So maybe you need band-aid now because that's how the world is, but it doesn't mean it will solve your bigger problem. Now, if you see a lot of the challenges why businesses haven't come to India earlier are challenges that we know of, right? The tough challenges of unstable tax environment, policy environment, business environment, trade environment. And unless we solve those, PLIs might just support for 2-3 years. But what happens after that? What happens when PLIs are going to close and all PLIs are only for 4 or 6 years? What happens after that? So when a company makes a decision, they are going to make a decision for 10, 20, 30 years, not just for the 3 or 4 years when the government is giving some cash back. So that's one reason. And the second reason is that we know from past experience that when you have pro-business policies, the ones who get benefits, they always prevent those benefits from reaching to the broader market, right? So once you get a PLI policy, you will want to modify PLI so that others and your competitors don't get in. And that's a classic unintended consequence that we know of, which is called rent seeking. And it's not just unique to India, but it happens everywhere else. And that's why pro-business policies are require very high state capacity in order for it to work well. And I'm not sure we have that state capacity.
I mean, it's a great reminder, Pranay, because I do think that whether it's explicit or not, a lot of people in power today derive inspiration from the sort of quote unquote East Asian tigers, right? My favorite kind of anecdote in this whole PLI world, I'm sure, is one that you're familiar with. I first read about it in a column that Andy Mukherjee wrote for Bloomberg about how the government had given a PLI subsidy to Hyundai for, I think, battery manufacturing. And it turns out it was the wrong Hyundai. It wasn't the Hyundai auto company, but another company called Hyundai. And of course, it was quite embarrassing. And they had to later sort of walk that back. But it tells you a little bit about the kind of unintended consequences, I think, when you're putting government in power.
Absolutely, Milan. And see, the PLI would have made sense if we identify some limited number of strategic sectors, and the government puts in money for a short time. Things which are really strategic from either a geopolitical sense or for the future technology sense. But now we are seeing PLI across every sector. Now there are 14 PLIs, last I counted, including to things like textiles. Why do we need PLI for textiles when this is the area which was supposed to be one thing which India was good at? So now it's just become one-stop solution for every sector, and that doesn't work. We are still not removing the real cost disabilities and the reasons why production in India is costlier. Those are not being removed. We are trying to apply a band-aid on a bullet wound, as I said.
The book is nothing if not a kind of clarion call for evidence-based policymaking, right? And one of the things you write about, and you could note the concern on the page, is what we're seeing is, and I want to quote here, a more direct confrontation between the Western philosophical and scientific thought, what is now often referred to as the Indic alternative. And what I want to ask you is, is this a case of basically, the pendulum swinging one way and then just sort of kind of overcorrecting itself? Or do you think that there is going to be long-term lasting damage caused from this sort of anti-science, anti-evidence kind of, we will go on blind faith sort of view?
Yeah, no, I do think there are losses to these kinds of things, and over time, we now see a lot more noise about this. So there is a section on Ayurveda or especially homeopathy, etc. in the book as well, a brief section. So there are we do see some spurts when these ideas again become popular, and that is the current moment. But again, the way I see it is, again, it is a lot to do with the social media environment that we are in, a lot to do with the fact that Overton window on exactly any issue in the world has just been stretched. You can have opinions on every particular topic in any way, and you will still have followers, and you will still have a reference network around it. So what that leads to is feeling that there are we are regressing in a way to other ideas. But I do think there are many people on the other side who would call it out as they should. So that exists, but because of the media environment, we do feel that the world is regressing to older ideas sometimes.
On the last page of the book, Pranay, and maybe this is a way to kind of bring this conversation to a close, you have this very ominous statement where you write the following: the coming together of three trends, an all-powerful and ideological new establishment that questions the choices we made at our founding moment, the shrinking of the quote-unquote middle space in public discourse, and relying on sentiment to defend questionable policies. These three portend a different social compact than what was established post-independence. Now, what's funny is when I read that, I was thinking about the United States because, again, this is not something that's unique to India, right? I mean, this could apply to many other places. How do you think about the Indian case in comparative perspective? I mean, is there something happening in India that makes you more pessimistic? Do you think it's part of this, some kind of global contagion? I mean, how do you think about the current moment, which you write so eloquently about in India? How does that match up globally?
Yeah, again, I do feel it's not that India is unique in this case. It is like in other parts of the world and other democracies, we are facing that challenge of populism, challenge of questioning of the principles that actually made these democracies successful in the first place. So a lot of those ideas are being called into question in India and across the world. So that is something worrying. But I am an optimist, and I do believe that a lot of these ideas will run their course and will get challenged, and even in India there are responses to each of these challenges. So that's where my hope lies. But yes, that challenge is not something which is to be taken lightly. We are seeing that, the people on the conservative side, imagining offenses, dispensing punishment, etc. Often, and it's no longer the fringe, So that is something which is challenging and very worrying. But also there are people who are, there is a time frame to which you can use these issues. Beyond that, people are also looking now at economic growth. What is India doing, given the world is looking beyond China as well in many ways. So that's where I think a lot of checks would come from. People are asking questions on the economic side rather than the religious and the cultural side. And I hope with that we will shift the political discourse more towards what the state should be doing, rather than letting the state go off doing things which are not in its domain at all.
Or debating what the state might have done in the 15th century. Just to pick up on one final thing you said, on this question of sort of tolerance and discourse and speech, right? You do worry in the book that free speech is in for rough days ahead. I think that's the phrase you use. And it's not only because of right of center conservative rhetoric, but also because of actions on the left, right? And I think a lot of the popular writing, a lot of the books you and I probably both read on Indian democracy, talk a lot about efforts on the right to shackle free speech. Just say a little bit about what worries you about what's happening on the left.
Yeah. No, the idea on the left is, somewhat similar to what you talked in the American context, that the same thing that it becomes an ideological purity test, often that some people are not left enough, and hence they should be challenged because of something they did in the past, or supported a political party which now is doing things that they don't like, and things like that, right? So it's an endless ideological purity test, and what it leads to is that the number of people who are collectively opposing people on the conservative side just keeps shrinking sharply, because of this purity test, and you keep calling out people who are on your own side, and it just leads to narrowing down of the people who can actually stand up to people who are batting for majoritarianism, right? So this is something which is there, and it's happening in India as well. Another reason is that because of social media, again, what happens is that our reference networks are now global. There is no issue which is local. Every issue by default is global, and that is where again both the left and right, those terms don't make sense in the Indian context, but conservative and extreme left views both find global resonance of their ideas. And because these are debates going on in US, etc., and we are so connected to the US debate, so intimately connected, that those debates come here and they form a nice khichdi, and we keep seeing those debates going on in various directions. It happened during the farm laws debate as well, if you recollect.
My guest on the show this week is the scholar Pranay Kotasthane. He and his co-author Raghu Jaitley are authors of a new book called Missing in Action: Why You Should Care About Public Policy. Pranay, this is a wonderful book, and is such a well-written, accessible book, which is, going back to where we started, there are books on public policy. A lot of them are not necessarily enjoyable, accessible books. Congrats on the achievement, and best of luck with the book.
Thanks, Milan.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review to help others find the show. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Production assistance comes from Nitya Lab. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.